Welcome to another episode of Cadence Fishing TV and the second episode in our guide to float fishing on rivers. And the subject that we're going to talk about is bolo floats and bolo fishing. So what is bolo floats and what is bolo fishing? Well, bolo floats are top and bottom floats, so fished and trotted through the swim, a bit like a stick float, but they're different in that they're typically used with a bulk shotting pattern and they're used with longer rods. The method actually originates from the Bologna region of Italy and is popular over on the continent, and it came over here sort of in the late 80s. For the most part, telescopic long rods are used, so 6 metre, 7 metre rods. In the UK we tend to use more standard match rods, and the Cadence range has rods up to 18 foot, which are absolutely great for bolo fishing. But we'll look at that in a bit more detail. So first off, I've narrowed my selection of bolo floats down to 5 different patterns that we've got here. So I'm going to take you through each of those. But before I do, I think I'll just emphasize what I was talking about in terms of the reason for fishing a bolo float. And the reason I would fish a bolo float is when I want to fish further out from the bank. So perhaps further out than I can fish efficiently and easily with a stick float. The depth might be greater, the flow might be greater, or it might be a windy day where I need a more positive approach, a more positive type of fishing. And that's where bolognese fishing really comes in. Another area is when you're fishing with bigger baits and when you want to really slow the bait down. So let's take a look at these 5 different patterns, and I'm going to start off with what I call the finesse bolo. So the finesse bolo, you can see it's quite a slim body. It's got a nice long taper on the body, but it's still got a small shoulder at the top. It's got a carbon stem. Now all of the bolo floats I've selected have got a carbon stem, and there's a good reason for that. When you're fishing with a bolo, you're fishing with a positive bulk typically, and you want to be able to cast the float efficiently, accurately and easily without tangling up. And a float with a carbon stem is going to be quite light. If you used a float with an alloy stem, for example, or a heavier base, what you can get is a situation where the rig cartwheels through the air because it's fighting against the bulk, and that's where you can get in all sorts of trouble with just casting efficiently but also creating more tangles. So for the most part, all the bolos I use are going to have a carbon stem for that reason. Secondly, it's got a good hollow tip, which I'm going to be able to see when I'm fishing further out at range. One of the main factors when you're fishing with a bolo float. So when would I use a finesse bolo? Well, for me, I'd use a finesse bolo when I'm perhaps struggling with presentation with a stick float or a pole, and I want to fish that bit further out with a positive bolt rig. I might be fishing a bolt rig because it's a deep peg, or I might be fishing a bolt rig because I want to get through some small nuisance fish like bleak. So if I just show you the actual rig here, in this case I've got a bolt which is formed from this olivette, and I've actually got some number 9 shot spread out below, which I'll explain a bit more about. But basically you can see that this rig is created using a bulk as the majority of the capacity of the float, and that's in the form of this olivette. The float I've actually set up is a 2 gram finesse bolo, and this is a pattern that Steve Mayer sold a few years ago. It's a great pattern. I know that other similar patterns are available on the market. I know Dave Harrell does a very similar pattern. It's a float that I really love. I use it in 2 and 3 gram, and it just fills that niche where I want something a bit more positive than a stick float, but I don't want something that's too positive that's going to restrict my bites. So I've still got an element of finesse about it. The rod I've set this up with today is our very versatile CR10 15 foot zero. I talked about this in the stick float section, but for me this is a very, very versatile rod. It's got a beautiful soft tip, nice through action, that's still fast, and enables me to use light lines and small hooks. And I've paired it up with our CS10 3000 reel, and in keeping with the finesse nature of the rig, I'm using our 3 pound mono, float mono, which has a diameter of 0.14. Now, I mentioned the number 9 shot, and for the most part I don't tend to use any spread shot on a Bolo rig. I tend to use a bulk and then a positive dropper, but in this situation I'm not casting it big distances, and I can get away with spreading out some number 9 shot like this if I want. Of course I could bulk all that together and make a nice double bulk presentation, which I'll just do quickly. So in that case I can bring all those number 9s together and form a nice positive dropper. But on a tough day when I can get nice presentation, I can spread that out, and that can make all the difference. So this rig's a bit of a compromise really between a Bolo and a stick float in terms of presentation. So hook lengths and hooks that I'd match up with this, obviously in keeping with the finesse nature of the rig, I'd be using finer hook lengths down to sort of 0.8 perhaps as a minimum, and I wouldn't be going above, I don't think I'd be going above 0.9 really. So 0.9 would be my maximum. And on the hook side of things, obviously as well in keeping with finesse, I'd typically be using the Drennan fine match hooks, which I really love. Really proven, and I use them in sizes from a 22 down to, well, maybe a 16, but definitely an 18. And I've also been experimenting last season with these Drennan finesse hooks as well. Very similar pattern. It's a great type of hook, crystal bend, nice and fine, but actually surprisingly strong. If you hook a better bonus fish like a perch or a chub, you've still got a chance of getting it out. But as I mentioned with the stick float, it's all about balancing your tackle. So one other thing to say with my Bolo rigs, and in fact with this finesse rig, is I quite like to build in a section of fluorocarbon into the rig, like I did on the stick floats. In this case I've used the 0.16 pure fluorocarbon from Edge, and like with the stick floats, what it's doing is it's just stiffening up the key section of my rig where it really matters, just helping me to reduce tangles that can happen when you're casting a Bolo float. I've still got the nice finesse nature of the reel line, the 0.14 reel line, so when I'm casting it's lovely. I can use a light float and I can cast it no bother. In this case, if I use an 0.16 reel line, I might be struggling to get my distance with a lighter float, but that to me is a lovely balanced outfit, and that's what I call the finesse Bolo rig. So the second pattern is my favorite type of Bolo float, and for me the most versatile and one that I used most of the time. This is actually a pattern that we did back in the Super Team days. And again, I know that there's similar patterns out there now. Dave Howell does a really good version of this type of float. So you note that the body is a little bit more pronounced than on the finesse. There's a little bit more of a shoulder. You've still got a lovely shape, which is streamlined. And for me, that's so important with a Bolo. You don't want too much resistance when you strike off the float. So a float like this is going to exit the water nice and cleanly, and hopefully not cause any problems with bumping fish. So this is like a step up, I suppose, in terms of positivity over the finesse, which enable me to fish further out, perhaps fish with bigger patterns. I use these up to a size 6 gram, so I've got from 3 to 6 gram. I can use it efficiently to catch fish very positively, like dace, when you're catching good amounts of dace, roach, and obviously other bonus fish like chub and perch and fish like that. So this is my go-to float really for Bolo fishing, I'm going to use that in conjunction with an olivette. Let's pick the float here. So there you go. That's what you can see what I'm talking about. I've got a very, very positive olivette there. This is a 5 gram float and I've got a 4 gram olivette. So that's a non-toxic Drennan version. I'm trapping it with a number 8 shot and I've got some number 6 shots below it. And that's forming that positive dropper that I was talking about. So for the most part, I believe the Bolo is a positive method. That dropper is going to enable me to read bites, especially when you're getting bites off fast biting fish like dace. You hopefully be able to read the bites and fish in a nice positive way. So that's the actual float there. I'll have to swing it round and show you. So same as the ones I was showing you. You'll notice that all my Bolo floats I'm securing with 3 rubbers. So I can, like a stick float, I can change the Bolo if I want. It's not got an eye that the line goes through. I'm trying to keep the rubbers as neat as I can. The bottom one's overlapping again. So very simple really. And that's what Bolo fishing is. It's simple. On this version I've stepped up the rod. I've gone another foot. So this is a 16-foot rod. This is our number 1. Extremely versatile. We offer 2 powers in this, our number 1 and a number 2. For most of the situations I'm fishing on the Bolo with this type of rig, I like the number 1. Nice and forgiving, but enough power to play the fish efficiently and also cast as well efficiently. Reel line, I've stepped up the reel line, so I'm now using a 016, which is 4 pound in our float mono. Just gives me a bit more leeway if I want to step up my hook length. So if I start to target some bigger fish, I can fish a slightly heavier hook length. So typically hook length wise on those, I'll be going from perhaps an 010 up to an 015, which again is going to cover a lot of my Bolo fishing when I'm fishing on rivers like the Severn, the Wye, the Avon. Really, really versatile setup. Again, on this rig I've got a section of 016 fluorocarbon here, just to help stiffen up the main part of the rig where I've got my bulk of my shot, just to help reduce the tangles. But one thing I must emphasize when you're casting is the fact that you're really going to feather the rig into the water. You're not just letting it crashing into the water, you're actually stopping it and almost placing it into the water. That's really, really key. So that's the second rig. So this is the third pattern of Bolo float, one that I don't use so often, but when I do use it, it's absolutely brilliant. It's quite a kind of unique situation for me. These floats have been made by my good friend and Trent legend John Small. John's from over Lincoln Way and basically has a fantastic record fishing on the Trent. Lots of venues, but particularly the Trent, and they're quite famous for catching silverfish like roach on the tidal Trent and the main Trent. So when I'm fishing on the Trent, you're often faced with a very stiff downstream wind, which makes presentation with almost any other float very difficult. And John's obviously spent a lot of time thinking about these floats and designing them for that situation. So you'll notice that they've still got a very nice sort of slimline top to the body, a little bit like the second pattern really. You've got a carbon stem that's a little bit heavier and you've got a long cane tip. Now that's a key attribute of these floats. The floats are actually a bit longer than most Bolos, and that's all about the need to try to control the float in a downstream wind. It's tricky because you've got to hold onto the float and control it without the wind pulling the float unnaturally. And these floats work really well. The combination of shape and weight, length of tip really does work. One thing I'll mention about floats, all my floats pretty much are either yellow or black. Gives me the combination to choose with the colour of the water that I'm faced with on the day, the ripple on the water, and on the Trent it's nearly always black. but John's made these yellow so I can use them and black them out if need be. So I'll carry these in sizes from 2.5 gram up to 5 gram. And for me, it's a compromise between trying to get the presentation in terms of the hook size and line diameter to trick roach and dace, which can be hard to catch on venues like the Trent, and to enable me to fish positively and effectively at range if need be on a big river like the Trent. So when I'm fishing on the Trent, I'm going to go even longer with my rod. So in this case I've picked the CR10 18-foot number 1. Again, number 1 is sort of my go-to choice for most versatile fishing, especially if I'm fishing a bit finer like I am for roach on the Trent. But I've got the fantastic advantage of that extra length. The 18-foot length is absolutely brilliant for controlling my float out into the river, particularly in those tricky downstream winds. So our 18-footers are just absolutely amazing. I love them, and they're not heavy, they're nice and lightweight, the actions are fantastic. For me, that's as long as I go with a Bolo 18-foot. It's obviously going to cover deeper pegs and when control's really difficult and when you're fishing further out. So one thing I just want to show you about this rig, applies to all float fishing of course, but this is a 3 gram float, and you'll notice that I've got 2 shot above the float, 2 back shots. In this case they're number 8s. That's something that's really helpful when you are faced with that downstream wind. So what it means is it's almost like that dropper is sinking the line behind the float and enabling you just to hang on to it and hold on to it enough for you to be able to get control of it in a downstream wind. Sometimes I might spread them out and have another one further up like this. Basically you just need to play about with it. You could use bigger shot, you could use number 6s or 2 number 8s. You might have the dropper, or rather the back shot, much closer to the float. It's all sort of things you need to adjust on the day to get it working right. And another thing to mention, particularly in this situation, but nearly all the time when I'm fishing with a Bolo float, is I've slightly overshot the float as well. Just means I can hold on to the float that little bit better without it riding out the water. So 9 times out of 10 with this rig I'll be overshotting it, and I've gone against using an olivette on this rig. Of course you can use an olivette, but I quite like using a string of shot. In this case they're number 1 shots, and I've got some number 8s. I've got 1 above it and 3 or 4 below. I just find a string of shot like that just seems to be more streamlined, and the fact that I might want to overshot it, I can easily add shot to it. So what I'll do is I'll just add a number 1 or maybe 2 number 1s to overshot it, and I can do that in a very neat way, as opposed to having an olivette and then sort of number 1s shot, which can look a little bit cumbersome and also cause tangles. So in this case I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 number 8s as my dropper. It's nice using 5 number 8s rather than 1 number 4 or 2 number 4s or 1 number 1, just because it's that much more streamlined, and I feel it's just giving me that bit better presentation, in keeping with the fact that I'm probably going to be targeting roach and shyer fish. Hook length there is quite short really compared to what I would normally use with a stick float, but just in keeping with the positive nature of the rig. One thing to say, you always want to make sure that the hook length, so the length of line from your hook to the first dropper of the bulk, is shorter than the distance from the bulk to the dropper, because that just helps reduce tangles as well. In this case I'm not actually using a fluorocarbon rig on there. I'm just going straight onto the main line. Works perfectly well, and again by a nice steady cast, either underhand, side cast or overhead, nice and positive and smooth, and just making sure that you feather the rig into the water. But that's a rig that I say I don't use very often, but on its day absolutely devastating. So on this rig, I'm going to be fishing quite fine, maybe 0.8 hook lengths up to sort of 0.10. You know, the roach on the Trent, if you're having a red letter day and you can step up and fish a heavy hook length and a bigger hook, great, but a lot of the time you got to fish with some finesse. And hooks wise, a lot of the time I'm going to be using fine match again, or the new finesse hooks from Drennan. Sizes, like to be using a 20, but I will drop down to a 22, maybe an 18. If I was catching well and perhaps felt there's a chance of some bonus fish, then I'd perhaps step up to a carbon match. But a lot of the time that's the type of hook I'm using, a nice lightweight hook, plenty of finesse, and enabling me to get the best out of the rig and hopefully fool the fish. So the fourth pattern of Bolo Float is a heavier version, and as you can see from the shape, this is much more kind of aggressive in the shoulder. It's got a thicker tip and bigger sizes. I'll carry these from 6 up to 12, even 14 grams, this type of pattern. This is for fishing really deep, powerful pegs, fishing for bigger fish with bigger baits, maybe fishing in flooded conditions, when you've really got to get some weight down and control the float. Also for fishing at distance as well. So it's not a float for finesse fishing by any means. You can't use small hooks, light lines. You're going to be using bigger hooks and bigger baits, targeting bigger fish like chub and maybe bream, odd barbel. So I'd be stepping this up appropriately. I haven't actually got a rig set up for that, but in terms of reel line, I'd be using something like the 0.18 5-pound edge floating mono, which is going to enable me to use heavier hooks and heavier hook lengths. For the most part, I'd be using an Olivet and positive droppers for this type of rig. And hook wise, I'm going to be using something substantial, something like 11 or a 13, 7-11. Obviously a hook that I talked about before with the stick float section, but a great hook, a strong hook, and maybe even moving up to stronger patterns like the Drennan wide gape hooks, from 14s down to a 10 maybe, depending on the bait, and even a super spade if I was faced with fishing for chub and barbel on a very powerful peg. I'd have to fish a heavy hook to balance everything up. In that case, I'd use the 18-foot number 2 rod, and it's not a float I really like using because of the fact that it's got such resistance when you strike, but there are days when floats like that with that kind of aggressive shoulder can really work well. So the final float in the Bolo selection is these beasts really, and these are what I'd call a bread float. So sometimes when you're fishing on rivers like the Y and the Severn targeting chub, bread's an absolutely devastating method, and it needs a positive type of float, and these certainly are. And these are made for my friend Andy Burt, my great mate, such a top float fisherman, and he's designed these to his specification, and they work absolutely brilliantly. So instead of having an insert tip, you've actually got a complete body that is formed into a tip. It's obviously got a really thick tip, and it's designed for fishing heavy bulks, big droppers and big baits like big pieces of bread. Absolutely devastating. Still got a nice carbon stem, so that again it's quite a light float. It will follow the bulk. The big tip's great for visibility and buoyancy. Having said that, you still want to dot it down and even overshot it, like I was talking about with the other Bolo floats. A lot of the time you're overshotting them so you can hold them back and control them. When they're really having it, and it's just a case of getting the bread in as quick as you can, getting it to the fish, hooking the fish, then you can pretty much let it go, just control it nicely, hold it back every so often, and that'll suffice. but I carry these up to 11 gram. There's 8.5 and a 6.5 gram version. And I've got one set up here to show you. I've set it up on our CR10 16-foot number 2 rod. So obviously I've got a great rod in terms of length to help me with presentation and casting. 16 foot's a brilliant length, particularly on the Y. Really is a big help. You can see there that I've got a substantial Olivet, which is 5.5 gram, and the float itself is 6.5 grams. This is my favourite size for fishing on the Y. Enables you to cast the float out a long way, still be able to control it. You're not forcing the cast. You know, you've got bread on, which can be quite soft, and you're not going to get tangles. If you're in command of the float and the cast, it's quite an easy operation. Again, I've got 3 rubbers on it, so I can change the float. Easy to change the depth. And I've got some substantial droppers there. They're number 4, so I've got 3 number 4s there. And I'm following the same principle of ensuring that the hook length is shorter than the distance to the Olivet. But yeah, I suppose that's about as crude as it gets really for bolo fishing. Main line, I'm using my maximum main line, which is typically 018 in the float mono, and I've got a section of 018 fluorocarbon to help stiffen up the rig. Hook lengths are going to be quite strong and robust as well, in keeping with the rig, so I'll use lightest 014 up to an 018 millimeter hook length. And hooks, depending on bait and size of fish, again, could be a B711 in a size 11, or super spades, or the wide gate power hooks from Drennan. So similar to the other float in terms of the strength of the hooks, but just matching it to the bait and the target species that you're hitting. So on the bread, I quite like using the size 11 B711, but I will even use a size 8, like a specialist type hook, when I'm using big pieces of bread. Well, that's a summary of my top 5 bolo floats that I use for river fishing. I hope that's helped. All the details of our Cadence products are on our website, as are the Edge products on the Edge website. So get out and give it a go.